The summer heat hung heavily over the ancient city of Alexandria as Queen Cleopatra VII stared across a kingdom that was slipping from her grasp. The magnificent harbor, once crowded with merchant ships carrying riches from across the Mediterranean, now reflected a far darker reality. News of defeat had spread throughout the city like wildfire. The disastrous Battle of Actium had shattered the military alliance between Cleopatra and Mark Antony, leaving Egypt exposed to the growing power of Octavian. Inside the royal palace, servants moved quietly through marble halls, afraid to speak above whispers. Advisors brought reports that grew more alarming each day. Roman legions were advancing steadily toward Egypt. Cities that had once pledged loyalty to Cleopatra were surrendering without resistance. Allies abandoned her cause, hoping to secure mercy from the approaching conqueror. Cleopatra had spent her life mastering politics, diplomacy, and survival. She had outmaneuvered rivals, forged alliances with some of Rome's most powerful men, and preserved Egypt's independence through decades of turmoil. Yet even she could see that the situation was becoming hopeless. Every messenger who arrived at the palace carried fresh evidence that her enemies were closing in. The people of Alexandria sensed the coming catastrophe. Markets remained open, but fear lingered in every conversation. Families discussed escape routes while merchants hid valuables. Many remembered the brutal consequences of Roman conquest and feared what might happen when the victorious army entered their city. Despite the growing panic around her, Cleopatra refused to surrender to despair. She continued sending envoys and letters, searching desperately for a political solution. But behind her confident appearance, she understood a terrifying truth. For the first time in her reign, there was no clever strategy left to save her kingdom. Egypt stood on the edge of destruction, and the queen could already hear the footsteps of history approaching her door. As Roman forces tightened their grip around Egypt, Mark Antony found himself trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. Once celebrated as one of Rome's greatest commanders, he had led vast armies, conquered territories, and stood among the most powerful men in the known world. Now he watched everything unravel before his eyes. Soldiers who had sworn loyalty to him deserted by the hundreds. Trusted officers switched allegiance to Octavian, believing Antony's cause was already lost. Each day brought new betrayals and fresh humiliation. The defeat at Actium had broken more than his military strength. It had shattered his confidence. Reports arrived constantly, describing Roman victories and the collapse of his remaining defenses. The reality became impossible to ignore. The empire he had hoped to build with Cleopatra VII was crumbling before his eyes. Then came the devastating news that pushed him over the edge. A messenger informed Antony that Cleopatra was dead. Believing the woman he loved had taken her own life rather than face capture, Antony was overwhelmed by grief. The shock destroyed what little hope remained within him. Refusing to endure the shame of defeat and Roman captivity, he chose to end his life. Drawing his sword, Antony attempted suicide. But death did not come quickly. The wound was severe, yet not immediately fatal. Agonizing pain spread through his body as blood poured onto the floor. As attendants rushed to his side, a startling revelation emerged. The report had been false. Cleopatra was alive and hiding inside her fortified mausoleum. Desperate to see her one final time, the dying Antony was carried through the streets of Alexandria. Too weak to walk, he was lifted by ropes through a window into the mausoleum where Cleopatra waited. There, surrounded by fear and sorrow, she held him as life slowly faded from his body. In her arms, the once mighty general took his final breath, leaving Cleopatra alone to face Rome's vengeance. The death of Mark Antony left Cleopatra VII isolated and vulnerable. The woman who had once negotiated with kings and commanded the wealth of Egypt now found herself surrounded by enemies. Outside her mausoleum, Roman soldiers maintained a constant watch, ensuring that the queen could neither escape nor rally any remaining supporters. The fall of Alexandria was complete, and Egypt's fate rested entirely in the hands of Octavian. At first, Octavian treated Cleopatra with a measure of courtesy. He understood her value as a political symbol and wanted to avoid provoking unrest among the Egyptian people. Guards were instructed to protect her, and Roman officials spoke respectfully in her presence. Yet beneath this appearance of kindness lay a far more ruthless plan. Cleopatra quickly realized that she was no longer being treated as a queen. She was a captive whose future had already been decided. Octavian intended to transport her to Rome, where she would serve as the ultimate trophy of his victory. During a Roman triumph, victorious generals paraded defeated rulers through the streets before enormous crowds. The spectacle was designed to humiliate conquered enemies and glorify Rome's power. The thought horrified Cleopatra. She had ruled as pharaoh, worshipped by many Egyptians as a living goddess. To be dragged through Rome in chains while spectators mocked her was a fate worse than death. Every story she had heard about defeated monarchs haunted her thoughts. Some had spent the rest of their lives imprisoned. Others had been executed once the celebrations ended. Determined to avoid such humiliation, Cleopatra attempted one final round of negotiations. She offered treasure, loyalty, and political cooperation in exchange for mercy. Octavian listened but remained unmoved. Meanwhile, Roman officials cataloged Egypt's immense wealth, seizing gold, jewels, artworks, and royal possessions. As her kingdom was stripped away piece by piece, Cleopatra understood that she had run out of options. The queen who had spent her life controlling events now faced a future entirely controlled by someone else. Only one choice still remained in her hands. As the days of captivity dragged on, Cleopatra became increasingly consumed by a single question. How could she escape the fate that awaited her? The walls of her mausoleum, once intended as a monument to royal power and eternal glory, now felt more like the confines of a prison. Roman guards monitored her movements closely, and every visitor was watched. Although she was treated with respect, Cleopatra understood that the courtesy shown by Octavian was merely a temporary measure. Once she was transported to Rome, her dignity and freedom would be gone forever. Ancient accounts suggest that Cleopatra began carefully studying different methods of death. Stories circulated that she consulted physicians, scholars, and trusted servants about the effects of various poisons. Some historians even recorded claims that condemned prisoners were used to observe how different toxins affected the human body. While the accuracy of these reports remains uncertain, they reveal the depth of Cleopatra's desperation and determination. Her fear was not simply of dying. Death itself seemed almost preferable to what she imagined lay ahead. The prospect of being displayed before cheering Roman crowds haunted her waking hours. She pictured thousands of strangers mocking her downfall, celebrating the destruction of her kingdom and the collapse of everything she had fought to protect. The humiliation would not end with her alone. It would become part of history, remembered for generations. At night, sleep offered little relief. Antony was gone, Egypt had fallen, and the future of her children remained uncertain. Every familiar source of strength had vanished. The queen, who had once commanded armies and negotiated with emperors, now spent long hours contemplating her final decision. Meanwhile, Octavian grew increasingly suspicious. He knew that Cleopatra possessed both intelligence and determination. Guards were ordered to remain vigilant, and efforts were made to prevent her from taking her own life. Yet the tighter the Romans tightened their control, the more determined Cleopatra became. She had lost her throne, her lover, and her empire. The only thing Rome had not yet taken from her was the power to choose her own ending. The final day arrived with an eerie calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos that had consumed Egypt for months. Cleopatra seemed to understand that the moment she had been contemplating for weeks was finally at hand. According to ancient accounts, she spent her last hours putting her affairs in order. Messages were delivered, instructions were given, and a final letter was sent to Octavian. In it, she reportedly requested that she be buried beside Mark Antony, the man whose death had left her alone against the power of Rome. Rather than appearing defeated, Cleopatra chose to present herself as a queen until the very end. She dressed in magnificent royal garments and adorned herself with symbols of her authority. The image she wished to leave behind was not that of a prisoner awaiting humiliation, but of a ruler who refused to surrender her dignity. Beside her stood her most loyal attendants, traditionally identified as Iris and Charmian, women who had remained faithful even as her kingdom collapsed around her. What happened next has remained one of history's greatest mysteries for more than 2,000 years. Ancient writers offered conflicting explanations. The most famous story claims that a venomous Egyptian cobra, often called an asp, was secretly brought into her chamber concealed within a basket of figs. Others argued that she used a hidden poison, possibly carried in a hairpin or small container. Modern historians continue to debate which account is most likely, and the truth may never be known. Hours later, Roman officials entered the chamber and were met with a haunting sight. Cleopatra lay motionless upon a couch, dressed in her royal attire. One attendant was already dead, while another struggled through her final moments. The queen's face reportedly appeared peaceful, as though she had chosen her fate and accepted it. When news reached Octavian, his victory was overshadowed by frustration. Cleopatra had denied him the spectacle he desired. Instead of marching her through Rome in chains, he was left with only her lifeless body. In death, the queen had achieved the one freedom Rome could not take away. When news of Cleopatra's death reached Octavian, the conquest of Egypt was effectively complete. The last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty was gone, and with her death ended nearly 3 centuries of Greek rule over Egypt. Although Octavian had achieved total victory, he had been denied the triumph he most desired. Cleopatra had escaped the humiliation of being paraded through the streets of Rome as a defeated queen. Even in her final act, she had exercised a measure of control over her destiny. Soon afterward, Egypt was formally absorbed into the Roman state. No longer an independent kingdom, it became one of Rome's most valuable provinces. Its fertile lands and enormous wealth would help fuel the growth of an empire that would dominate the Mediterranean world for centuries. Roman officials took control of government, taxation, and trade, while the treasures of the Egyptian royal family were claimed by the victors. The fate of Cleopatra's children reflected the harsh realities of Roman politics. Her son, Caesarion, was viewed as a potential threat because of his connection to Julius Caesar. He was captured and killed on Octavian's orders. Cleopatra's younger children, by Mark Antony, were spared and taken to Rome, where they were raised under Roman supervision. Their lives would never again resemble the royal future their mother had envisioned for them. As years passed, stories about Cleopatra spread throughout the Roman world. Roman writers often portrayed her as a dangerous temptress whose beauty and influence had corrupted powerful men. These accounts served political purposes, helping justify Octavian's victory and strengthen his image as Rome's savior. Yet beneath the propaganda was a far more remarkable figure. Cleopatra had been a skilled diplomat, an intelligent strategist, and a determined ruler who fought relentlessly to preserve her kingdom's independence. Her final days were filled with grief, fear, and impossible choices, but they also revealed her resilience. Though she lost her empire and her life, she achieved something few rulers ever manage. She became immortal in history. More than 2,000 years later, the name Cleopatra still evokes fascination, mystery, tragedy, and power, ensuring that the last queen of Egypt would never truly be forgotten.